this is something that's actually gotten a lot of press in the last couple of weeks, or week even. The press, all the press I've seen has gotten wrong what this graph is actually showing. It says, you know, check out this graph showing how Earth has changed. It's not showing that at all. What it's showing is the cycle of the biosphere's respiration. And it's taking 20 years and then compressing and averaging the behavior of the biosphere between 1997 and 2017 into this loop. So you'll see the same thing over and over and over again here. As the white descends from the north down towards the United States and Central and into Central Asia, that is ice. That's the winter months. And likewise at the bottom, if you look at Antarctica, it changes shape quite a bit as well. And you're just seeing the contraction and expansion of ice. In the oceans, yellow means plankton. Yellow means carbon sequestration and life. And we want to see more yellow. Actually, the purple means there is no life in terms of plankton. There's no plankton life. But that's a process that consumes about, that takes care of about 50% of the biologically based carbon sequestration we have, the reduction of greenhouse gases through other living things just living out their lives by consuming that carbon and using that to generate new life. And then on land, you see something we've been talking about a whole lot, which is the changes in seasonally in forests and vegetation. And so the northernmost regions of vegetation obviously are frozen about half of the year. The central latitude regions of Europe and Asia and the United States are sort of in between there. And then the equatorial regions where the tropical forests are green year-round. But the point of all this, to me, is that this is literally how we are able to exist. And I come from a background of religious people and musicians. So I have actually a fairly, I would say, spiritual orientation towards life. I'm not a very religious, I'm not a religious person, but I'm a very ethical person, and I love everything that I have learned from religion, and many of my best friends and family are extremely religious people. And so I just want to share real quick a few ideas in a sort of abstract way about what we're looking at here. What we're looking at is our reality. You know, our consciousness is precipitated by the biosphere itself.
On the new topic today of animals, and I'm just going to do a tiny bit of review here. We did a lot more than this last time, but one of the things we did is we talked about the 3 different types of plants in aquatic systems. And those are going to be those that have floating leaves. And interestingly, I put on here floating weeds with floating leaves. And that's because these particular ones, these 2 species here, are considered to be weeds in most systems, so detrimental. And we talked a little bit about that last time, but I'm mainly going to just show a few pictures and just go through a couple of slides. Water hyacinth is also a aquatic leaved, floating leaved plant that is considered a weed. It's noxious. It's creating a problem in a lot of these states that are shown here in green in the United States. And it's actually worldwide. You'll find water hyacinth in a number of different places. This is another one called giant salvinia that is can be a problem. It's a lot less dense and a lot less problematic areas than hyacinth is. And then we move into submerged. And so there's 3 types of aquatic plants: floating leaved, submerged, and emergence. And coontail is a really common variety of submerged plants. And the definition of a submerged plant is one that roots on the bottom and does its growth below the water surface. Because I say that because emergence will come up to the surface, and usually when they hit the surface, they'll actually die. That upper portion, as it hits the surface, will die. The plant's still alive, but the upper portion is not, because that's not what they really were intended to be doing. They really over time have evolved to where they will try to grow out of the water. just because they're growing so fast in places where the nutrients are appropriate for them. But the definition is such that the living part of the plant is submerged. Southern Naiad is a US based and also can be a problem in some places. Variable leaf milfoil is present in a lot of North American water bodies. Notice here's an example of floating the leaves that are above the water surface.
Why this is so important to your overall performance of your portfolio or mix of investments, whatever you want to call it. So, as I've said this before, that you already have skills to manage your own investments. Very often, this is what makes people stop really going forward and actually putting money into investments, because they are so afraid of making a mistake, especially women. Women, if they don't feel that they understand, will not take an action, where men will take an action. But even men sometimes are a little hesitant about delving into the world of investing. If you recall last time, we talked about the different tiers, right? So budget is the first. The second one is really saving. People generally don't have an issue with saving because they know that it's a guarantee, right? There's an interest rate. At the end of the month, it's going to be just a little bit higher than it was at the beginning of the month. Where in investing, you're not sure, right? Things go up, they go down, you can take a loss. So we're going to take a look at this in a careful way, but I just want you to understand that this is not really rocket science. There are some basic principles that we're going to go over, and then it really takes more diligence in terms of reviewing and looking, as opposed to, in the old days we used to say, you know, set it and forget it and don't even open your statement. Well, that's not true anymore. The market is a little more volatile because of politics and just everything that's happening. So things do require some attention, and that's really what it takes. So let's go into what is asset allocation. So I like to think of this as making soup. You have different ingredients, right? You might have, you know, meat, potatoes, carrots, other different types of spices. That's really, the asset categories are like the ingredients, okay? So you want to come up with your own personal mix of how you're going to create your portfolio or your investment mix, right? So you're going to look at a few basic things. How long do I have to invest? How much tolerance do I have of risk?
The results were phenomenal. We just found dying vegetation rebounded. Lots of new vegetation started to self-volunteer, and that which we planted was doing far better than what was going on with our neighbors. And when I mention neighbors, I'll segue into one of the first things we did is we organized an annual neighborhood tree planting. And this was for a number of reasons. We were reacting to the fact that our urban neighborhood had very barren, solar oven-like public rights-of-ways. So there was not much community interaction because it was so uncomfortable to be outside. So we went door to door knocking and introduced ourselves, and then set up these potlucks and whatnot, and where we all asked each other, what do we want as a community? And everyone wanted more life, more community, more interaction. So, and people weren't really into going to the neighborhood meetings. So we thought, all right, let's do something different. Let's organize an annual tree planting, and let's bring life back into the public realm. But at the time, the city's tree planting program only offered exotic, ornamental, invasive species. They weren't offering any multi-use species that produced food. They weren't offering any native plants that were the best suited for our climate, soils, and wildlife. So we made our own plant list, and with their blessing, we're able to use that, and they agreed to acquire those trees for us at a subsidized cost. The other thing that we really wanted to push was, which was a radical 180-degree shift, was plant the rain before we plant any tree. So every tree had to go into a water harvesting basin, which is, at the time, that was the opposite of what would happen. People would typically plant on mounds. I think that was done in part so they wouldn't have to dig so much to a hard soil. They just bring in loose soil, put the mound there. The landscape industry liked that because they could sell more product, but it didn't perform well. But our planting in the basins did great, and we found we had at least a 50% greater success rate with those trees planted in basins compared to those just planted at grade. Because if people forgot to water or just ignored the new planting, it had a much better survival rate. The other thing, when we selected these, we made our own plant list, we selected, we looked to the local ethnobotanical record, and we looked at what species were used for the most uses. So we combined the best adaptation of these native species with greatest use. So food production, medicine, fiber, other craft materials, and so on. Even though we didn't know how to use all of them, okay, we just knew they could be used. And that first year, we planted over 200 trees just with neighborhood volunteers.
Okay, so I think I was just saying that, yeah, I was very inspired by my naturopath growing up, but I wasn't too sure if that was the direction I wanted to take. So I did journalism for a little while first, straight out of school. And when that wasn't really stoking my fires enough, I jumped across to naturopathy. So I got advanced diplomas of health science in herbal medicine, nutrition, naturopathy, and yeah, and I've been doing it ever since. So
wow, how many years of school? How many years of school was that? Sounds like quite a credential.
Yeah, it was all broken up because I went traveling for a couple of years in the middle of my studies. So I started naturopathy in '96, and I think I finished completely everything I wanted to do by 2003.
Wow.
And I've been working as a naturopath ever since.
Wow, you don't look that old. It must be the flower essences or something.
Thank you. No, I'm 38. I'll be 39 this year.
Wonderful. So I've got 20 years on you, so I'll be 58 this year. So
you're not looking bad yourself, Mike. You must be doing something right.
Thank you. It's the BioPro that we sell.
I'll be 88 this year.
Oh yeah, right. Wait. Yeah. So
don't believe that.
So okay. So now you're in you're a naturopath. You in Australia. Do you start a practice where you have people come to you to do that, or how does that work?
Yes. So the first thing I was doing as a naturopath was working in a health food store, giving in-store advice to customers, and then I worked in a clinic setting. I've worked in about 5 clinics over my time as a clinical naturopath, one with acupuncturists, one with medical doctors, GPs as we call them here, and one on my own, and one with a couple of naturopaths. So I've loved all the different settings and getting to work with different modalities. But then once I had children, I wanted to create a business that was a bit more flexible and that I could do from home without having consultations all day. And that's how Naughty Naturopath Mum was born.
Okay.
So Naughty Naturopath Mum's coming up to about 3 or 4 years old now. I think just 3.5 years old.
Awesome. And it is a wonderful website. I'd encourage everybody to go to it. And it's naturopathmum.com. The immune system and particularly how the immune system protects us, as the picture up there shows us. But more importantly, we were very specific in what we were talking about, and that was our thymus gland. The thymus gland, as we learned last week, is the main gland, if you will, that is kind of the overriding gland, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dad, on this, but as far as modulating the immune system goes, almost all the it's like command central. We used the analogy last year of centurions, which were the CD4 cells, how they went out and they found the bad guys, and then they contacted the SWAT team or the infantry, whatever you want to call it, which were the CD8 cells, and they told them where to go get the bad guy. Well, all that originates in the thymus gland, and so the thymus gland is like command central, if you will, and it sends out all these proteins, and it interacts, and it's all quite advanced, and it kind of got deep, and it kind of got boring, and this and that last week, but in the previous week. That's why Wayne said go back and watch it and maybe take some notes, because it's technical stuff, and we have to cover that technical stuff. It's really important. But needless to say, just go back and watch it, and I'm not going to rehash it all. Dad, did you have anything to add that you thought was important from last week?
Yeah, no, it is the general of the immune system. It regulates basically our immune system from the cytokines and the proteins that it produces, and how it stimulates the different lymphocytes in the body, and natural killer cells and dendritic cells, macrophages, and so forth. So it has a very distinct and important purpose in its function. And unfortunately, we do lose that function as we get older. By the time we're 80, I've been there. By the time we're 40, it's involuted to where it's just mainly this little blob of fatty tissue. It only secretes a fraction of the proteins that it did while it was in its heyday or in prime. And so the cellular immune system is, of course, depressed in its ability to act because of that. So basically, that's it, Mike. You covered it very well.
I gotta jump in because that was hilarious when you get the replay. When you turn 80, and then I've been there.
Yep.
Talk about Freudian slips.
Right.
Or talking from experience, either one works.
Yeah, whatever.
So last week I said that we were going to be talking about what we can do to help boost our immune system and everything else, and in not maybe, I don't know, it's not proper planning, but almost forgot a very, very important part of our immune system, and that's what we're going to learn about tonight. Next week we'll go into what kind of pull it all together, our immune system, and go into what we can do. We'll get a little bit into that tonight, but we're going to go into next week what we can do to boost our immune system. There's a lot of different areas that are all important. But tonight we're going to talk about the microbiome system.
We're more aware of the negative aspects of the chemicals towards their dogs than they were themselves, which I always, and it's not really funny, but it's pretty interesting. Turns out there's more studies done on dogs and cancer than there is people in terms of lawn chemicals, and on some level it makes sense. The dog has its nose in the soil in that respect and rolls around in it, but so do we. and our kids. So, you know, these things are really important. Excuse me. So, you know, this is what we want. You know, and everybody wants a lawn. It's aesthetic. You know, the history of a lawn is pretty interesting. If you look back and, you know, before lawnmowers and only the elite could have them, and they had sheep that ate the lawns, and you know, they were kind of a sign of well-to-do in society. But they've really, you know, and they're a ground cover, and they look the part. You know, so it's understandable on some level, you know, why we have this desire for the green lawn. It's also good to point out that, you know, the lawn is a perennial crop. It's not an annual. So there's this ability for it to establish itself and be as low maintenance as one can muster. You know, some people would argue with that, especially in the heat of the growing season and the peak of the growing season, where you got to mow it twice a week, it feels like. But you know, the reality of how we treat our lawns is not something to take lightly. You know, I mean, all of the conventional lawn care companies that you may be aware of, True Green, ChemLawn, all these big players are all using known carcinogens in our landscapes. And typically it doesn't come from the fertilization. You know, it comes from the repercussions of the infertility of the practices. In other words, the degeneration that ensues from you know, feeding your lawn a fast food diet over time results in pest infestations and disease and weeds and things that we approach with an element of extreme toxicity. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of that so that we can kind of get an anecdote of, you know, how you may be able to treat these problems. And, you know, it's really helpful, I think, to really see. I mean, if you look at that fertilizer that I plucked out of Google Images there, you know, it's a 3404. Well, a couple things. One is it's got a really, really high nitrogen number, which is typically what people are thinking about with a lawn, green it up. I mean, I wish it was that simple. The grass is actually a very complex crop. You know, the reason a cow or a ruminant can live off of grass alone is that it's a perfect food on some levels. It can fix more elements, grass as a species, than any other crop.
Angle, and the crown of the oak tree is going to be a little bit rounder, whereas if you're on high silica soils, the branches will be almost pointed straight up. They'll just get that pointier look in it. And I find it interesting that we've got something like cabbage. You can grow a cabbage in almost a pure drought because it'll collect dew right out of the atmosphere and it waters itself. So there's something about this calcium form that is hydrophilic. Water just loves to hang around it. And you think about a cactus in the middle of the desert, that thing is collecting and holding and storing moisture for you. So these are just interesting observations that, you know, you could go right to this plant right here. You just know just by looking at it that's going to be higher in calcium than, for example, this. This is going to be higher in silica than any of those. Now, calcium is used in every single plant cell reaction for really good learning on various different mineral cations, of which calcium is one. Take some training with Midwestern Bioag out of Blue Mounds, Wisconsin. They had Gary Zimmer and his crowd. They refer to calcium as like the truck driver, that this is what's taking all of the nutrients to the plant. Sulfur is the key that unlocks the door that lets those nutrients go through into it. So this calcium is very important for transporting minerals to the plant, within the plant, etc. And because calcium is so important, there are more plants that actually like calcium-rich environments. There will be a greater diversity of plants in a calcium-rich environment. There'll be fewer species in a calcium-deficient environment. And if you want to look at one thing that's probably the most quote-unquote deficient in any of your garden beds, if you're growing any kind of crops whatsoever, be calcium. And it's not calcium carbonate. Yes, will adjust the acidity of your soil and make it less acid. It'll raise the pH. However, that's not all that calcium is for. Calcium, once the pH is around neutral, you'll have more available nutrients on the periodic table for that plant to uptake. So calcium can help to raise the pH to neutral if it's acidic at all. But it's so important for opening cellular transport pathways and to be part of all the different movement of minerals inside of a plant. And water is absolutely key to this, and sulfur is part of it. If you can imagine a lump of clay, for example, try to make a pot out of a lump of clay. You really can't do it. Well, if the lump of clay is the plant, and your hands are like calcium, this is really what's going to be starting to give that plant its form and its essence and all that, but you can't do it without you know, some kind of lubricant. In the case of the clay in your hands, it's water.
So yeah, I'm going to jump on into what I want to talk about is the big picture of solar power, and have us think about the whole ecological context of all the design work we do, building buildings, growing our food, you know, everything in our communities. We're really surrounded by the Earth's ecosystem, and the Earth's ecosystem just runs on solar power. And so if you think about it, really, the plants on our and some of the single cell organisms in the ocean are primary photosynthesizers, and they actually are sort of the power plants for almost all life on planet. You know, there may be a couple of extreme microbes down in the ocean vents that have figured out a way of getting by without the energy from the sun, but almost everything that we have around us in terms of life is just being run on the sun. And you know, all the heat that is generating our weather is coming from the sun. The sun is heating the air and therefore creating our wind and heating the surface of the land, heating our bodies of water. It's becoming it's really the primary driver of the weather. And as a result, all the wind power that we use is really just an indirect form of solar power. The sun is creating the wind, and then we harvest the wind. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is that we use wind power as of right now to generate a lot more of our electricity in the US than we do direct solar. Wind is about, according to the Energy Information Agency, it's about 5.6% of our electrical generation right now.